doing construction on my building, which is great.
We're ready to go. I've just started the recording.
Oh.
So welcome everybody. My name is Christina Matheson. I'm from the National Habeas Institute. We've got Jeff Trenchard here. He's going to be talking to us about interviewing clients who have experienced trauma. But before we get started, just wanted to thank everybody for coming. And thank you all for just the incredible work that you all are doing. And I know you guys were able to just sort of witness as we're sort of setting up in our conversation, kind of sharing our own backgrounds and where we come from. But we thank you all. I know everybody who is in this audience is very interested in helping people who've experienced trauma, whatever your field is. And that is a very, very difficult task. And so we thank you all for doing that. And we also know that it's a generally low paying work. And so just acknowledging that and asking you all if you could take a little time, give NHI like $5, $10, collectively, we can all do something to make a difference.
Retweets and shares, you know what I mean? Like spread the word if you don't got the bread. That's all.
Exactly. Yeah, we're on social media. We're on Twitter. We're on LinkedIn. Please like us, share us, all the things that people do on social media. For those of you who know me, I'm personally not a social media person. I'm very, very private, but very much appreciate all of you who do social media because we need you. So thank you to all of you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks, friend. Thanks so much for inviting me to this. So all right, I'm going to start early here, getting the screen share situated, see if I can do this well without embarrassing myself. We're sharing and we're presenting. We're doing good. All right, boom, let me go back, boom. I'll give it a second to load, boom. All right. Christina, can I get a thumbs up? Everything look okay on your end? Everything good? Thumbs up, cool. Okay. So just to kind of echo what Christina said, thank you so much for taking the time today and for all the work that you do. Also on this particular day in which I feel like it feels especially crappy to be a person who is businessed with the interaction with the legal system. It's been a bad 4 years, I would say generally, but like this is one of those little extra awful ones where you're just like, wow, it's just going to be a 6-3 Supreme Court for like, who knows how long of the worst people ever. And like, they managed to, late season, in this final season of America, they decided to just add on the most obnoxious, like, she reminds me of like a secondary villain in like The Handmaid's Tale, right? Like she's too nice to be like the main antagonist female-bodied person, but like she feels definitely in that mix. Anyway, so my name is Jeff Trenchard. Until very recently, I worked for New York City Gay and Lesbian Anti-Violence Project. Primarily my work was with queer asylum seekers, LGBTQ folks seeking asylum, from the various places where you can be killed for such things. And then also doing a fair amount of domestic violence, intimate partner violence work, orders of protection, just dealing with assorted sketchy situations. I left there in July because of the COVIDs and the need to take care of my family. So now I've started doing a lot more of this. Also just kind of like an interesting and important fact about this presentation that I'm going to be giving to you. So before law school, for about 10 years, I taught creative writing. And I worked mostly with young people who were incarcerated or were in like a long-term foster care sort of situation. That was how I wound up going to law school, is I was like, well, I can teach you to write a really great poem, but there's no poem that's going to be so good that it's going to get you out of jail. So I did a lot of that work, which I found once I became an attorney was a lot of pretty transferable skills, right? Like I sit in small rooms with people and they tell me about the horrible things that have happened to them. And then we write those things down and we make a little story. And hopefully that story gets them asylum, or, you know, I'm sure in like a lot of folks, a habeas grant or parole or whatever, right? Like that's the nature of what we do, is we sit and we hear horrible shit. And unfortunately, I feel like none of us really got any decent amount of training on these topics. And it's only just now that we're like coming into a recognition that I think that, you know, I would imagine everyone on this call kind of shares, is that like trauma is the undercurrent of our whole work, right? There is no aspect of poor people law, of criminal, immigration, housing, or family law that doesn't really wrap itself around trauma one way or the other. So what I have for you is the best practice checklist for interviewing clients who've experienced trauma, or how to do more good than harm by your client in your case. It's definitely oriented with an immigration and particularly like an asylum lens, but I do really feel like the things that I'm talking about are applicable to whatever practice area. I also imagine there's going to be a lot of folks that have like heard some of this stuff before. Hopefully I'm saying it in at least somewhat interesting way. Also, just before we get into it, there is I'll get into the thing. So learning objectives. So my hope is at the end of this that you can recognize the common physical and behavioral signifiers of trauma, right? How trauma shows up in the body. I also want to review some material choices that consistently create an environment where a person who's experienced trauma is able to discuss that experience, right? As we all know, this is never a one-time, you know, hey, nice to meet you, tell me your horrible story, and then boom, we just ship that joint off to the judge and we're good to go. That's not the deal, right? We have these long, sometimes months, sometimes years relationships with our clients. And so it's really important, I think, to develop a really good working relationship throughout the course of that. So that's what I'm going to talk about a lot. And then I want to talk about I'm going to discuss the realities of working in a high trauma environment in 2020. This has never been a really chill job. I feel like I was admitted to the bar 2015, so I had like a little sliver of time operating under government that, like, for all of the numerous faults of the Obama administration, which I feel like this group could really well go into, you at least had a government that was interested in governing. And right now we're governed by a multinational crime syndicate, and that's just different. And we as lawyers who are being governed by a multinational crime syndicate, it does very particular things to us with regards to concepts like vicarious trauma, vicarious resilience, et cetera, et cetera. So that's all going to be talked about at the end. All right, so why is this important? You're all here voluntarily, but I like to just recap in case, I don't know, you got to send this off to your supervisor. Like, why did you spend your day doing this? So trauma underlies every aspect of criminal, immigration, housing, and family court, right? These are the terms, they're non-negotiable. Issues from memory loss to establishing relationships, every aspect of your client relationship is affected by trauma. There is no public defense in any way, shape, or form where, like, you're not dealing with either the trauma of this person's experience or the current trauma of them being moved through our legal system. Attorneys, I feel like, must have a working knowledge of the effects of trauma in order to competently represent their clients. I feel like, while I know that it does work the other way, where like big firm attorneys will take on like an asylum case because they want to, like, make the pro bono newsletter or whatnot. Like, that is, I think, really unfortunate, because like I would never deign to think that I could do a complicated, IP case or like something having to do with some other area of law that was inherently governed by like real scientific known factual elements that if I am unfamiliar with, I have no business practicing. So I feel like we should probably talk about that with trauma too. Also, more than anything else, our state of mind can turn neutral comments into fighting words, distorting what we hear to fit what we fear. I'm sure we have all experienced this, particularly in this moment of COVID, particularly those of us who are cohabitating with human beings. Like, you're sitting there, right? And you're just saying like, hey, if you put the fork in the dishwasher fork side up, it gets it cleaner. It just does. It's just like, that's how it works. And you say that, and then the person turns to you and is like, well, what do you mean by that? And you're like, look, I learned a thing on the internet about how to load your dishwasher. I'm just sharing that. Like, what's the problem? To be totally clear, in this hypo, I am the person who is getting really offended at the dishwasher critique, and my partner is the one who learned the cute thing on the internet, to let people know how to do things better. But that's the thing, is that our minds, we will react differently depending on where we're at and how we're feeling, which can have detrimental effects on every aspect of our life, particularly when we work in the law and everything that we say will be held against us, right? As clients, as lawyers. So here's the agenda. First, we're going to talk about trauma in the brain. It's like the quickest breakdown of like neurobiology. I have been described by a colleague as a living BuzzFeed article in a nice way. So it goes pretty quick, but it gives you a lot of things that you might want to continue reading up on. Next is setting the stage, so preparing yourself, your environment for dealing with a trauma-informed interview. I wrote this and created this presentation before the current weird world that we live in, and I've adapted it and put in some things around remote work. But to that end, and I'll bring this up again, I feel like it's just important to name that like we're all doing the best we can with the remote work, but that's not the business. Like that's not the lawyer thing. The lawyer client experience is not one that I feel like can be exactly transferable over the Zooms. So I have some stuff that can improve practice, but I feel like because we're all lawyers and the moment that we hear best practice, we actually hear I'm terrible. I just want to note and name that no, like we're asked to do a really impossible thing right now. And I maybe have some stuff that will hopefully make it easier, but if it's not applicable, that's not on you, that's on the situation. So anyway, so next is doing the thing, which is really getting into the trauma interview, right? Like when you're talking about the horrible thing with the person. And then we're going to do a little checklist review. I like to do a Broadway style break. So usually around the checklist review, we'll do like a little quick 5, go, stretch, get a breath, you know, reset your eyes, refresh your browser window. And then at the end, I'll talk about the realities of 2020. Maybe not reset your browser window because, you know, we all pray to the gods of Zoom and it's a very delicate prayer that our things don't shut down. But you know what I mean? Like we're going to take a little break for like 10 right at the end there. Also, at the end of each section, I build in time to talk about and just for like some Q&A and like we can just discuss how you're feeling about the material and stuff like that. I'm really bad at multitasking, so Christina's gonna let me know all of the questions that happen there because otherwise I will just get lost in my many browser windows and it will be bad. So all right, so here we go. Oh, there we go. All right, so trauma in the brain, emotions are really real. You will find I'm big on subtitles. All right, so here, let's start. I want to start with a definition of trauma. This is from the American Psychological Association, and it is somewhat problematic. Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like accident, rape, or natural disaster. Again, like, or just like right off the bat here, like I feel like we have like a pretty clear vision of trauma in this sense, but it's one that presumes a pretty normative situation, and then accident, rape, or natural disaster like throws you off balance. This definition of trauma and some of this understanding of trauma, where it's like this strange thing that happens to you that you can't incorporate, does not quite speak to the experience of being not white in America, the experience of being not cis hetero in America, the experience of being not a citizen, right? Like there's a lot of ways in which there's a lot of situations, what it's like to grow up in an abusive situation or be in an abusive situation, where there's a lot of situations in which trauma is the norm. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I just like to again, like flag off the bat that this is a limited definition, but one that is worth starting for. So immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical symptoms like headache or nausea, right? While these feelings are normal, some people have difficulty moving on with their lives. It's pretty basic understanding that we have all of trauma. This definition I like a lot more, which is that this is John Allen. Trauma is the subjective experience of objective events. The more you believe you are in danger, the more traumatized you will be. The bottom line is the overwhelming emotion and feeling of utter helplessness. If there's any Ta-Nehisi Coates fans out there, he's got an amazing discussion in Between the World and Me where he talks about being jumped like repeatedly. And it's like all about this like feeling of like helplessness. There's another article he talks about later that I'm going to reference later on, but it's that feeling of like almost disembodied experience is what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. Is the feeling that you do not have control over your physical corporal matter or the thoughts therein. There may or may not be a bodily injury, but the psychological trauma coupled with psychological trauma is coupled with psychological upheaval and plays a leading role in these long range effects. One of the things that I find really important about this idea of the subjective experience of objective events, two things that I think are important, particularly in immigration work, where so often we need to connect the kind of trauma that the person is experienced with an aspect of their identity. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I mean, in intimate partner violence work, this happens a lot, but we wind up having to sort of rank the traumas as we are speaking to our neutral detached magistrate, right? Like we have to like order them in a way that we get the most important stuff in there. But what's important to recognize is that the person who experienced that may not rank those that way. That doesn't mean that you need to change your motion in order to fit their vision of what's most traumatic, but it's important to recognize when you're talking to them and they're reading the papers and you're just moving through this whole case, that their understanding of the worst moment of their lives may not be the same as yours. And those are very culturally specific, and it has a lot to do with how that information and that experience was contextualized in their larger experience and not just the thing in and of itself. One person is not more traumatized because they were shot versus another person who just had the gun pulled on them. That's not a correct way of looking at the situation. Next. All right. Trauma versus PTSD. PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, develops when people have had experienced shocking, scary, or dangerous events from the National Institute of Mental Health. Again, like, it's natural to feel afraid during or after the traumatic situation, but people who have PTSD may feel stressed or frightened even when they are no longer in danger. For a real-world example of PTSD, I would like to tell you a really endearing story about my mother-in-law. So my mother-in-law is from East Meadow, Long Island. I don't know if there's any New York people out here, but you know, we're out here. She moved to Rochester to pursue her nursing degree, where she met her husband, who lived in Los Angeles and was a doctor. And so they moved back to LA, had several kids, one of which eventually would become my partner. When they were in Los Angeles in, I think, 92, there was the Northridge earthquake. If there's any California people, I'm originally from San Jose, so you will relate to this. The Northridge earthquake, which was a sizable one and caused, you know, massive destruction. My mother-in-law's house, it caused part of her house to fall into another part of her house, sort of make somehow less house when the house falls into the house. And had her youngest daughter been sleeping in her bed that night, she would have been crushed and killed. Thankfully, she was not. She was, you know, sleeping somewhere else, and so it was all okay. But I bring up the geographic situation because I, as a Californian, like, earthquakes are scary as hell, but like, it's different when you're from California. People who are from the East Coast, I have found, have a horrible time with any earthquake at all, even if it's small. And the Northridge was not small. So my mother-in-law is the most earthquake preparedness person that you have ever met in your life. All of the stuff, all of the furniture in the house is like bolted to the thing in their house. All of the cars that her kids drive, you know, always got an extra pair of shoes just in case, you know, because it's $3. So like, what if you have your high heels and there's an earthquake, you need to run, extra pair of shoes in the car, good sneakers, right? All of the things are always, she is an incredibly earthquake preparedness human being, especially because she's also a nurse and a nurse educator. That's not PTSD. That is a appropriate and, dare I say, incredibly endearing reaction to a traumatic situation. PTSD is having to move out of California because you can never stand the idea of being another earthquake, right? PTSD is never being able to go into a tall building again, right? Freud, also a not less than problematic figure in psychology, said that a healthy psyche is someone who is indicated by someone who can work and to love. And I feel like that's a good indicator when we're talking about the difference between trauma and PTSD, is like whether or not your daily operations are affected drastically by the experience you've gone through. The DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, puts it at about 6 months after the effect. If there's still things going on from that incident, that's when they may be looking at like a more clinical diagnosis. Now, complex PTSD is the thing that gets at the thing that we talked about earlier, right? Many traumatic events, and this is from the, you know, that bastion of out there woo-woo psychology, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs. However, in some cases, people experience chronic trauma that constitutes repeats over months or years at a time. So PTSD is, I was attacked, I was in a car accident, I was in an earthquake. Complex PTSD is, I grew up in an abusive house, or I've been in an abusive relationship for a really long time, or I grew up in a cult, or I've been in prison, or in a carceral situation generally, or I've existed in a world that does not acknowledge my humanity for various reasons, and I'm constantly subjected to micro and macro aggressions that deny the very existence and validity of my humanness, right? So that's what complex PTSD is like that the ocean floor, or, you know, or that the sea level, right, is like the ocean floor, that your understanding of like how bad stuff could be is really skewed because you've been subjected to discrete trauma over a long enough period of time where you can no longer totally tell what's being paranoid and what's a real understanding of people actually out to get you. repetitive or prolonged is usually some of the things. Some of the interpersonal or indirect harm winds up going into it. Also, types of vulnerability and vulnerability relationships play a big aspect of this, right? So if there's like a dependency relationship between the person committing the trauma, that can like really create the PTSD. It's one thing to be like, you know, it is horrible to be sexually assaulted by a stranger. To be sexually assaulted by a relative, particularly like a parent or a caregiver, carries with it a whole other connotation because the very fabric of sort of social order has been torn asunder. This is a really important one, which is that your brain does not contain memories, your brain is memories. Um, Fun realization that I'm sure we've all had as careers and lawyers, which is that there are some structural issues with the way the legal system understands cognition that are phrenology level inaccurate, right? Are sort of like tripartite or quatride breakdown of mens rea as like, you know, willing, knowing, right? Negligent, right? I always found this when I was in law school to just be like a real game of synonyms. It doesn't actually speak to a meaningful distinction, I feel like, in the cognitive experience of someone's life. And neurobiology has shown this out, right? The way that I feel like most legal systems deal with the brain is that it thinks of your cognition, right? And thinks of your spirit and your sense of self, your sense of identity as existing sort of like Google Drive, right? Like, where like it exists outside the body, right? Like it's like, oh, well, if you drop your phone in the toilet, if everything's backed up to Dropbox and iCloud, you're fine, right? Like with the law, barring major physical contusion to your traumatic brain, right? Like barring that, this is not affected by what's happening here. And nothing could be further from the truth. Every single waking moment of your day changes you. If there's any Octavia Butler fans, right? Like all you touch changes you, you change all you touch. Your brain is rewiring itself constantly in order to better understand how to keep your corporeal body moving through space-time, right? Like your brain is recalibrating. So what is reasonable to a person who, I don't know, hasn't had a square meal in years, is constantly under the threat of physical violence, does not see any prospects for the future, and has had it proven to them repeatedly that there is no such thing as a legitimate legal authority that will come help them, right? That person's reasonable as to how to deal with conflict is very different than, say, most of the people who sit on the bench, right? And that's because their brains are literally quite different. It's this concept called neuroplasticity. Lots of links, please look up. This is your brain on PTSD. Your brain literally looks different after you've experienced long-term PSD. There are parts of your brain that are associated with stress that become aggravated, that become like enhanced and become kind of, or not enhanced, engaged kind of constantly because you're always on the lookout for the next thing that is trying to destroy you. So this is Dan Siegel's hand-brain model. I link in my in the slides, which I'll send to Christina and we'll make available. There's a great way that Dan Siegel kind of breaks this down, but if you've ever seen the movie Inside Out, is actually a really accurate depiction of cognition. It's by Pixar. It's really adorable. I highly recommend. There's going to be a lot of like animation references in this presentation. I'm like, I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, and so like the brand is strong. Yeah, this is kind of what your brain looks like, right? Like this stuff on the front here is what is taking place during Inside Out, where it's like all of your prefrontal cortex, which is where all of your language things happen, and all of your like good short-term memory stuff, and all of those things happen kind of up here in the front. This middle section, right, the limbic brain, develops years basically from the time that you're born until you're 3 years old, and it's more or less in charge of your emotional regulation, the way that you kind of like emotionally contextualize things. There's a presentation in the bibliography that talks about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, ACEs, and there is a tremendous connection between people who've experienced extreme trauma at a very young age and tremendous long-term effects because their brain is still under an incredibly important aspect of development. And then there's your brain stem, which is in the back, which is sort of like just keeps all of the, you know, eating, breathing, endocrine situation situated. What happens when someone is afraid and someone gets like and there's a recognition like, oh shit, I might be in physical danger, or oh shit, I might be in tremendous social danger because we're pack animals and we lived as incredibly tight units of packed humans, where being kicked out of your tribe or your family unit meant certain death. So there's a lot of evolutionary holdovers in terms of like how we relate to one another, because this whole idea of just like, I'm a person in the city, I can just get new friends if I don't like this person. That's not, that hasn't really sunk into who we are as, you know, evolved apes. So when you get hit with some of that resistance, when you are afraid, or you're reminded of something that has made you afraid, your brain stem floods your system with cortisol and adrenaline, and you literally flip your lid, right? Your neocortex, your prefrontal cortex goes offline, and you're operating exclusively from your kind of like emotional core and the base things that you need to make sure that you stay alive. Um, Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score that I reference in here, and I is highly recommended reading. If you were only to read 2 books on this, check out The Body Keeps the Score and by Bessel van der Kolk, and Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. I cite to both of them, and there's lots of links and all that. Anyway, it's when someone is having a traumatic flashback, when someone is afraid they're going to be traumatized, when someone is just generally like engaged around these topics, it's as though the air traffic control portion of your brain traded places with the fire alarm system in your brain, right? So it's like you're literally not operating in the same frame of mind and with the same aspects and faculties that you're able to access because of what you're working with. So this idea that we all respond to things according to a reasonable person's standard is, it's completely ephemeral. Like it's utter nonsense. Okay, so here's a really great illustration of set of reactions to trauma and the cycle that it goes. So first there is that fight or flight, right? Sympathetic nervous system, which like responds. And then as you get more and more aggravated, you start to disassociate. And then once it kind of hits a peak, maybe sometimes freezing and immobilizing, the come down of like the shame and the hopelessness, all of that sort of happens. The one thing I don't like about this slide is that it gives, unfortunately, the impression that every time you do this like loop and then you're done. And that's not totally the case. That part where it's like from trapped into deactivation, but you're still kind of entrapped, that was really where I feel like I've hung out since like election 2016. Like, sometimes we're a little more aggravated, sometimes we're a little less, but we don't totally calm down anymore. And that's what generates a lot of that complex trauma. So recognizing external reactions, right? So becoming sweaty, overly loud, losing sense of boundaries after talking about testimony, experiencing something scary, having an argument, right? These things are very common. Over medicating, engaging in self-harm, becoming sweaty, complaining that your heart is pounding or that you're crying for, quote, no reason, right? I'm sure all of us have had that thing where it's like, yeah, I mean, middle of the day, no reason. I just started breaking down crying. I couldn't figure it out. And then you look at your calendar and you're like, oh yes, I totally like got screamed at by a judge for no reason. That's right. Like, you know, or I like sat there and I listened to my client talk to me about like all the horrible shit that had happened to them. Ah, yeah, right. Also, not being able to remember what happens or having a difficulty remembering simple tasks. This is a really common response to adrenaline. I'm sure we all remember walking out of like law school exams and you're like, oh yeah, I totally know about torts. I torted the tort out of that. I have no idea what the fuck I just did for the last 3 hours, but I used all my pencils. That's a common occurrence, right? And it makes our job incredibly difficult because we're dealing in details so much of the time. So, and then we like work with our clients and we're like, okay, why don't you remember this thing? It's like, well, because nobody remembers that thing. Because if I asked you to do long division right after you got out of a car accident, you'd probably forget about the remainder, right? Like that's not an unreasonable thing for someone who's been through a lot to go through. All right. I think it's really important to talk about how the fact that telling the story is re-traumatizing. So this is from a really great article I recommend by Ta-Nehisi Coates, doing kind of a mea culpa after the Me Too movement and hashtag took root, particularly around Cosby and like Cosby's just criminal spree over 30 years. Coates had to interview Cosby a few years before the New York Magazine article came out. And he talks about how he had heard a lot of the things about Cosby and the stuff. I mean, Cosby also kind of talked about it in some comedy specials, but you know, different era. But Ta-Nehisi really owns in this article that I linked to in the bibliography that like he's part of rape culture in this way. He's part of the problem is that he didn't bring it up because he was there to talk about pound cake and respectability politics and blah blah blah. And he's reflecting that he's never been raped, but he's been several times as a child. He's been stomped, right, and beaten up, and lost control of his body, and remembers just sketching this out. And this is like post Between the World and Me, Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is post Black Panther. This is post Case for Reparations. This is a incredibly established, incredibly powerful and strong writer at the height of their abilities, talking about how he is humiliated all over again in the discussion of this beating that happened so long ago. And he reflects, what would it be like to recount a sexual assault? And then what would it like to do that for a national audience? And it's the national audience part is why I bring this up, is because we, particularly those of us in the immigration context, create a file for someone that they very reasonably understand and think of as their story to the government. Like, we create a national record of this person's life. So I think it's really easy for us to forget that as lawyers, that it's really easy to forget that like it is humiliating. It is humiliating to talk about these things at all, much less have them recorded, much less than know that they're going to like be read by a known number of people, and all of those people are going to be literally sitting in judgment as to whether or not this is a good enough story, right? I also feel like it's really important to talk about how systemic abuse is inherently intimate. I think there's a way in which a lot of times in discussions around trauma, we pathologize the existence of it, or we talk about the systemic oppression as if it's totally extrapolated. And I really recommend reading this, which so beautifully sums up why we should tear down all Confederate monuments, because there are monuments to this all of the time around us. And people whose experience is a monument to the kind of violence that they've suffered, and that violence that is perpetrated by government actors, even if it's not as obvious as a forced hysterectomy, even if it's just dragging out someone's asylum claim, or like, whatever smaller bureaucratic violent aspect our system does, it is incredibly intimate, as incorporated very, very intimately, and affects people's lives in a very personal and individualized way. Also, trauma-informed practice must address systemic violence. I feel like there's these are just a couple of great tweets that I really appreciated the shit out of, which is, I think there's an unfortunate tendency now that we're just deciding to start talking about trauma, that our goal, because we're lawyers and we can't operate without a goal, but our goal so often is to feel like we're going to make someone safe, but that's not real. Like, my clients were for the most part Black trans women, and it's better that they're not in danger of being deported, but you're still a Black trans woman in America. And so I really love this about how our question is, how can our traumatized bodies, how can we heal our traumatized bodies so that we love each other and fight together? It's the framing around like, we're going to get this person safe, especially at this point in 2020, is very ephemeral, right? Like, none of us are safe anymore. But what we can do is think about how to get someone healed enough that they can continue to like exist. And again, like, love and work and like be engaged with people in the world. I mean, work like in a very, capital W, like have a orientation to the world where they create works that they like, not like necessarily have a job or any of that shit. So key points: not all people who have experienced trauma have PTSD, and not all people who have PTSD have CPTSD. These are separate individual ideas that have like a comorbidity and an overlap. It's also important to recognize that, like, again, like the dealing with our immigration system is traumatic. If you were not traumatized before you went through that motherfucker, you will be traumatized on the way out. So the act of what we are doing traumatizes people. Trauma is a subjective experience. The law and your client may differ about what the quote worst thing is. And trauma, PTSD, and CPTSD all alter your physical body and your literal brain. It's like wondering why someone hasn't gotten over the assault that they suffered as a child is very similar to wondering why someone has not gotten over their peanut allergy, right? It's like, God, I get it, Andrew. It's like you almost went into anaphylactic shock. Okay, not all Snickers, okay? Not all candy bars are out to harm you. You can't just go walking through the world thinking that if you don't make sure that like every place doesn't cook with peanut oil, that you're not gonna die. You need to get over it, right? We would never say that to someone with a physical condition. I love this illustration. And I love this quote. Both of these are by veterans. Americans must know that the scars from PTSD are very real and in many ways more painful than the ones caused by bullets or shrapnel. I have both. And I love this illustration too, which is by an indigenous artist who's also a veteran. But I feel like that's like a mood. Like that picture in there, like that kind of Basquiat being picked apart by crows. Like that's, I feel like when you're in the writhe of working with someone who's experienced trauma or like dealing with it yourself, like that is a that I am in that picture and I do not like it. So all right, questions.
So Jeff, we have a couple in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also had, I think, one question that'll be really easy. If you can type the name of the two books. I know you mentioned the body.
Oh, it's in the bibliography. I'll put it through and send the slides out. But it's The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. But they're both cited multiple times in here, and I have them in the bibliography. If you can, don't buy on Amazon. I just like to put that out there. Just Amazon is bad. They do bad things. These are essential works, but they can wait 7 to 10 days. Just hit at your local bookstore. Sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, and we have a couple of people saying recommendations for The Body Keeps the Score coming in.
Oh, cool.
Let's see. And then the other one was, have you ever considered or had the opportunity to present this, you know, kind of everything that you've said thus far to any judges? Just kind of noting that.
Yeah. Funny story. So I have done a presentation like this, similar to this, for asylum officers. If you're not super hip on the the immigration horrible corner of the world, when you are applying for asylum, if you are not already in removal proceedings and deportation proceedings, you go through an interview process with an asylum officer that may or may not be a lawyer, that is someone hired by the Department of Homeland Security in a non-adversarial context to interview you about the validity of your claim. Now, they may grant you asylum, or they may send your case to immigration court, and in which case you have minimum 3 years, maybe forever to wait, and who knows what the fuck is going to happen to you. So I did a presentation specifically on, or that addressed some of this stuff, and on bisexual issues and pansexual issues for the New Jersey Asylum Office. And I presented with a friend of mine, Heron Greensmith, and both of us are bi, and both of us are married and have kids. And so it was really interesting to do this presentation for a bunch of people who are like, oh, well, you have kids and you have a relationship that I would look at as straight. So what the fuck does bi mean anyway? So that was wild. And yeah, there was, I don't want to take up too much time on it, but one of the biggest problems, and why I would be amazed, I would love to talk to some judges about this. There's an Upton Sinclair quote about how it's really hard to convince someone to see something that they're paid to ignore. And I think that judges categorically, by the nature of their situation, are forced to ignore so many realities that are just obvious about their practice, right? It's like a friend of mine asked me, who I did similar trainings for. She was just taking a thing on Facebook. It's if you could talk to judges about how to serve better their clients, what would you do? And it's I don't even know where to start, right? Because if you're a judge, court rules. Court is fucking awesome. You show up, you get paid. You walk around in Harry Potter cosplay. Everyone stands up when you walk in the door. Grown people genuflect and beg and just oh, your honor, and are just as obsequious as humanly possible. You have armed guards just kicking it, who will velociraptor team up and bounce any defendant or respondent who gets out of line. Court rules if you're a judge. And I think to a certain extent, before we get into any of the training, the fact that so many judges and so many lawyers are so oblivious to the fact that if you are a non-lawyer, court is one of the worst days of your life. Any day in court is a bad day, because bare minimum, you missed work and you got to deal with childcare. right? Like even before we get into this body, best body keeps the score shit, I would need so many judges to just own the fact that they are mediocre upper middle class white people who graduated law school in the 80s and 90s, and they are not smarter or more experienced or like in any way in a position to judge any of their defendants or the respondents. They have played the video game on laughably easy the whole time, and now they're just sitting here banging their little Thor's hammer, right? Like the amount of self-reflection I feel like exists in the judiciary is pretty god darn low, right? So I am on social media a lot, and I've been trying to get the all judges are bastards hashtag started. I have not had a lot of luck yet, but maybe if there's some fellow Twitter people, we can get this cracking today. The zeitgeist feels right. I don't want to like run too long on assorted banter and bullshit. Are there any other questions? I can also hang out later. I just want to respect everyone's time and be like actually wrapped by 5.
First of all, you had some serious love on the chat
Good deal.
for that. But we have a couple.
Hashtag AJAB, AJAB. We can do it. We can do it. We can totally make this a thing.
We have 2 other questions, which you might get to both of these later.
If I do, I'll just let you know that that you're setting me up really well. So yeah.
Right. So the first one is, do you have suggestions for doing client interviews when you have to use Zoom?
Yeah, nope, coming up in the next segment. I got you.
Okay, and then the other one, kind of related, is how do you keep from re-traumatizing the client when you really need to get into the weeds and the details?
Also coming up, episode 3. Episode 2 coming up right now answers the first one, and then we'll deal with, you know what I'm saying? It's like the Mandalorian, you know what I mean? I'm just laying it out. It's gonna be good. Everyone's gonna lead. Next one's gonna lead in the next. We're gonna have callback characters. I may go grab my kid's baby Yoda just for a cameo. It's gonna be awesome. All right.
So I think that's it. So yeah, we're
cool.
set up nicely for the next segment.
Cool. All right. So first and foremost, I want to start with this quote. I heard this quote when I was auditing my partner's class at UC Berkeley when I did not go to that school. She's like, do you want to come to this class? It's called Controlling Processes, and it's taught by Laura Nader, who's Ralph Nader's sister, and it's really awesome. It's all about anthropology and all this great stuff. I'm like, I don't go to the school, babe. I just hang out with you. She was like, no, you can come in. It's auditing. You can just audit the class. You can even tell the teacher. I'm like, auditing? Really? I thought that was trespassing. Who knows that I audited all of those abandoned buildings and while I was smoking weed in them as a teenager. Who knows? I didn't know I was auditing at the time. Anyway, Laura Nader said this quote that in her class is like a throwaway line in like 2001, and it's stuck in my teeth, and it is in my mind and my heart all the time, which is that there's no word in the English language for the opposite of paranoia. There is no way to say you are appropriately afraid of people actually out to get you. I used to have to lead with this a lot more. I've been doing this presentation for about 4 years, and over the course of these 4 years, this has been an easier and easier sell to audiences of lawyers. There was a time when they'd be like, that's not fair, Jeff. How could you ever say that an entire branch of the government doesn't care about human beings and is actually excited about their death? No more. Now it's much, much easier pitch. So yeah, I like to think of this all the time, right? Like they are not paranoid, especially because I've worked, nearly all of my clients have had some sort of psychiatric diagnosis, usually PTSD. It's important not to overly pathologize people because that doesn't mean they're deficient. That means they're appropriately reacting to living in a film noir, right? Like the fact that they live in Blade Runner doesn't mean that they're paranoid, right? Okay. So also you are creating an experience. People will forget what you said. I love this Maya Angelou quote. I feel like you could walk around just speaking in Maya Angelou quotes and you would be a really nice person. It would be hard to order coffee, but it would be, I don't know why the cage bird sings, but do you want milk or not? People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And again, like going back to a couple of slides where there's a way that there's a cognitive impairment when people have a traumatic reaction, they're not going to remember exactly why they feel this way, but they're going to remember like, oh, Christina's office is like really nice and I feel safe there, right? It's like, oh, like, when I go see David, I feel like it's okay and I feel a little bit calmer and it's at least like a nice place to go. So you want to really be conscious of the experience, the total experience that you are creating for them in all of their interactions with you. So before the interview begins, back when we had rooms to interview people, I like to always consider the room, right? So, particularly where's the door and whether or not people have access to it. It may seem small, but if you've been trapped, it's a thing that you think about. Also, do you have tissue, water, and gum and mints? These are really important. One thing that happens really often when people get big flows of adrenaline is that their mouths dry out. Sometimes even get like a taste of copper or something like that in your mouth. And then that creates this negative feedback loop where it's like your body's like, oh shit, my mouth is really dry. Does that mean I need to be freaking out? Ah, I'm freaking out. Ah, my mouth is even drier. Ah, right. You would want these things if you started crying, particularly like tissues. Also, a good way to maintain a little bit of dignity on the subway is make sure you always have a little packet of tissues on you if you have to have just a little quick cry on the L train, as I am wont to do. Also, is there a visible clock, right? Because not knowing the time is disorienting. That's why there's no clocks in casinos. Also, in most government offices, a lot of courts, a lot of detained facilities, right? Same. There's no clocks because they don't want people to know what time it is because your time can feel really, really elastic when you're dealing with trauma. Um, I love this. This is just the most like poetic statement by any former chairman of the MTA, which is we all know the experience, every one of us, of getting down to the subway and not knowing what is happening, literally looking longingly down the tracks to see if we can see a white light. In New York, our subways, and I think a lot of other places at the bus kiosks when they have the digital ones, they'll have the time there because it's like, okay, well, it's 20 minutes. Looks like about I'm gonna get this Sudoku work. You know what I mean? We're gonna hit it. I'm gonna actually read this article before I retweet it because I got some time to sit here. Even though I'm pretty sure I know what it says. I think this is really important also right now, particularly in immigration practice, because our deadlines are all over the fucking place. We have no idea when any timing is ever happening. I like to create a lot of basically artificial timelines where it's like, okay, so I just mailed in your employment authorization. We're going to wait to hear back. Ballpark, we should hear back. We should at least get like a letter saying we got your shit in like 3 weeks. I'm going to make a reminder in my calendar and send one to you that if I haven't heard back, I'm just going to email you anyway. It doesn't mean that anything bad has happened. Sometimes they're just slow, but we're going to check in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. And I'm just going to let you know so you know I didn't forget about you. Um, that we represent people who are so often forgotten about. If we can just let them know that they are not forgotten, that they just got an email, that they just got a reminder, nope, sorry, no update on your case, right? It does so much to just acknowledge their humanity and acknowledge their experience and build trust with you because they know that you're not lagging on them, that you are at least somewhat top of mind for them. And it doesn't take more than just a like, hey, this is what's going on, right? Like just a quick, haven't heard anything yet, we'll let you know. When working with trans and non-binary clients. So there's a lot of resources out there. I have a link to a bunch of stuff on just terminology around gender. It's really like a lot of gender identity language has changed a lot over the last 10 years. It's really legitimate if you don't feel as conversant, but it is on you to get conversant in it. I feel like if you were representing like a lot of Muslims, you'd need to know like the different kinds of practices of Islam, right? Like very similarly, like if you're representing some queer folks, you might want to know about some queer shit. Um, in addition to that, just always keep in mind: do you have gendered or gender neutral bathrooms? This is always a very stressful situation, right? Even if you can't accommodate people with the kind of bathroom they would like, just letting them know that you understand and like letting them know like, okay, just FYI, my office only has like male female bathrooms, right? Also, particularly if you're in public spaces like in court and stuff like that, particularly with your trans women clients, and if you're a cis woman, if you can go into the bathroom or offer to go into the bathroom with them, just to make sure that there's no assaults, screams, or assorted other shenanigans. Similarly, like if you are a cis man and you have a trans masculine client who's using the men's room, oftentimes when you're trans, the choices are like men's room, women's room. Maybe get beaten up, maybe just get yelled at and have the cops get called, right? So it can be a real stressful situation, and whatever you could do as a lawyer to just acknowledge that stress is really important. Also, security process to enter your building. Particularly, so I live and I work in New York, and I deal with a lot of, I work with a lot of larger firms that wind up taking pro bono cases. And one of the things that happens a lot is that people will be given an address, but if you've ever been in Midtown Manhattan, there's nothing sensical about how the buildings are laid out. Like the entrance to a particular building will not be how it appears on Google. So meeting people down in the lobby can be a really, really powerful thing, just to make sure people are not feeling like they're getting lost. And no matter what you're building, like if you have a really overly enthusiastic security guard, it can be really awkward for your client. And just the showing of ID can be like a moment where that person needs to be apprehensive, like, God, is this gonna be some shit? Or am I just gonna be outing myself as trans to this person? That's fun, right? Because I just want to get into this fucking building. So yeah, so meeting people down in the security lobby is really, really good, or figuring out ways to de-stress that. Letting people know what the deal is going to be with like court, with body scans, with dead names, things like that. Just like being cognizant of the kinds of challenges and kinds of assaults and microaggressions that trans people deal with all of the time, even if you're not trans, and if you don't identify as queer, will really, really endear you to people, because it shows that you're really aware of the things that they are working with. Okay, in institutional settings, right? So dealing in carceral settings, I the advice that I have is learn and have on hand, not on hang, little Freudian slip there, the institutional official policies, but also be on the lookout for enacted ones. I taught creative writing in Rikers Island for a long time. There were many official policies, there were many unofficial policies. So the more that you can understand how it's actually working in that setting, the better. You're going to need to choose a uniform, because all institutions run on uniforms. A big inspiration and reason that I decided to become a lawyer was I would get like catcalled by the guards all the time, just for like dressing like the cool substitute English teacher, and like just say mugged up shit to me all the time. And then I like just started wearing a suit, and it's like, I'm a white man-shaped person, like, and I'm in a suit, I must be powerful. I highly recommend you leverage your institutional privilege, right? You're a lawyer, like that should be conveyed instantly on your visual appearance. Like I dressed up for jail the same way I would dress up for court. And I find that it works really well. It's really important to establish rituals in the discussion. We're going to get into the traumatic interview and the ways that you can establish like a rhythm when you're going through it. That comes up in the next section. But also just recognizing that the space is toxic masculinity incarnate, and you have to plan accordingly. You know what I mean? Like it's a factory of misery, as Reginald Dwayne Betts talks about it in a really great article. Like it's just a factory of terrible shit. So that's what institutional settings are like. When working remotely, as we all are, to be determined, make sure you're checking in on what their preferred method of communication is. A lot of shit could have been an email, as we are discovering, right? Or a text, right? But other things should not be a text or an email. So going over like your individualized communication protocols with your client, while tedious, is a good thing to keep some notes on, right? Like if it's, or just have a sense in your head, right? Like if it's a yes or no question and it's not a big deal, like text will probably be fine. It doesn't need to wait till the next meeting, right? If it is like something that's really deep, maybe it's phone, but maybe it's not Zoom, right? So think about what's going on for you in those moments and what's going on for them in the moments, because we're all sort of trapped in our little pods right now, our little cells. When are you going to check in? Again, like setting those artificial times, and by what means? Also, this is something I was thinking a lot about from an intimate partner violence perspective, as well as a carceral perspective. A little more tricky in carceral settings, because you're also being recorded a lot of times, or there's sometimes like some concern about that. Coming up with safety words or phrases to indicate that someone is in really extreme distress, I think can be really, really powerful, especially when you're working with somebody in a DV situation. Like if there's a way you can securely communicate, like, if it's really bad, tell me you can't wait to go out and get some cigarettes, right? So I know that it's like, oh, this is an emergency situation, right? But so often, particularly when because we're all kind of stuck in our homes, right? So even if our homes are jail, which is where they've been stuck, a way to signal to the outside world that there's something really bad happening here, I think is a powerful opportunity that we are robbed of when we normally would have our offices, and like we could create moments to really check in, like, are things okay at home, with some degree of privacy. I love this. So if appropriate, send clients pictures of the offices. I feel like this also works really well with like court dates, or if you're meeting up at like the Dunkin' Donuts, right? If you are meeting up with somebody at 26 Federal Plaza in New York and you say the Dunkin' Donuts or the Starbucks, that's Vegas shit, because there's like 9 of them joints on Broadway. But if you take a picture of it or talk about the thing that it's next to, it's like, oh, the Dunkin' Donut shop next to the pizza, got it, or like on this street or whatever, and like do the visual pictures of it, especially if people aren't like as English conversant or have dealing with literacy issues. This can be a really great way to just like show them where it's supposed to be. Okay. This is something that I picked up from my mother-in-law that is a really, really powerful frame to think about all of your interactions with your clients. This is AIDIT. It is what inpatient people who work in hospitals are supposed to say to you when they come into your hospital room, right? It's supposed to acknowledge you, introduce themselves, talk about the duration, do an explanation of what they're doing, and thank you for your time. Hi, my name is Patty Shalavutis. I'm a phlebotomist. It's going to take me about 20 minutes to phlebotomize your phlebotoms. We need to do this to make sure that everything is working in proper phlebotomistical working order. Thank you so much. Do you have any questions, right? The real, because I just like saying phlebotomy over and over again. The way that I actually knew this is, hi, my name is Jeff. I'm an attorney. I plan on us talking for about an hour today. I know you have some questions about your immigration situation. I'm going to have some questions for you. I'm going to need to know some of what brought you here, but we don't need to get too deep into any of the stories. I just kind of need the highlights of the main things that caused you to need to flee your country and to come here. Like I said, we can talk for about an hour. If you have to leave sooner, that's fine. If we need to go a little longer, that's fine too. Just so you know, I'm not going to have an answer for you today about whether or not I'm going to take your case. But I will be able to tell you when we're going to follow up and when we're going to talk more, right? So like, let them know what's going on. Let them know the explanation. Like, this isn't like Iraq, right? Like, you don't need to like hit all this shit or you lose points, but you need to make sure that your client is understanding what is happening and how long it's going to take and what their expectations are, right? Kind of similar to like if you were walking up as a waiter and you said, hi, my name is so-and-so, I'll be your waiter. These are the specials. Can I get you a thing? I'll be right back in just a second, right? Like, they're basic ways that we interact with each other that maybe get skipped over in this particular weird thing that we do. So normally I would recommend, or like if this was like a live session, I'd have you like work together on this and like break up into buddies or something like that. I recommend you do this on your own. And I really recommend that you try out your opening spiel and you try this out with non-lawyers and see if they are clear about what the hell you are talking about and if you sound friendly and approachable, right? And you can do the same kind of thing like with follow-ups. Thank you for coming back in again. Today we're going to talk more about your case. It's going to take about an hour. We need to talk about this, and then we're going to, you can modify it as go. But I really recommend running down a kind of scaffolding of what the session is going to be every single time, so it's just clear for you, clear for them, right? All right, some other good reminders. I feel like it's never bad to review confidentiality and privilege. Working with a lot of folks from Central America, where lawyers are very much more of an arm of the court, the idea of our magic bubble of confidentiality and privilege is amazing. And it's like really cool. Also, if you're working with people who've experienced trauma, they probably have a lot of shame around that trauma. So just letting them know that your secrets are safe with them is really good. Something I like, my quick shorthand, which you can feel free to steal, which is I explain to my clients that legally it's easier to get a priest to talk about what happens in a confession booth than it is to get a lawyer to talk about what happens in an interview with a client. And that's even if I decide I have to drop your case for whatever reason. I can't make, this is a hard no snitching zone, right? So like really emphasizing that with your clients, that their secrets are safe with you, because we are unfortunately going to be having to tell them to all of the court, or at least a version of them to the court. Give back sense of control at every opportunity. Is it okay to talk about this? Can we keep going? Do you want to stop? Do you need a break, right? Like, can I get you anything? Like, as much as possible, right? Does that sound okay? Just making people feel like they are not being moved along the machinery, the conveyor belt of justice, and you're just another cleaver hacking them up, right? I work with translators a lot. I am sadly monolingual. Something I found that's really good is to keep the translation to 10 to 30-second clips. All my immigration folks know the deal, because you need the exact translation. But also, I think it's really good to let the client know and the translator know that you're going to be interrupting them, right? So you just set this expectation. It's like, no, I need it 10 to 15-second clips, and I'm just going to like keep interrupting you over and over again. So you establish a very particular conversational style that is inherently going to be a little bit weird, but if you let everybody know that that's what's happening, there's again a different expectation, and it doesn't seem rude, or that you're like that you don't care about the thing that they're currently saying, right? You're interrupting them because you need an exact translation of what's happening. And again, talk to the client and the translator that you're going to need an exact translation. I do a lot of work with the New Sanctuary Coalition. And it's a lot of times like we work with a lot of volunteers. A lot of our volunteers are retired like social work teacher white ladies from the Upper East and the Upper West Side who will spend their Wednesday nights like talking to Garifuna like trans women about the shit that they've been through. And like I love my ladies of New Sanctuary with all my fucking heart. But it's understandably really fucking awkward when you're like a white person and like you're translating for this person, or you're like a cis older white person and you're translating for this person and they're saying like all of these slurs and like describing this violence that is incredibly graphic and terrible. And I've seen this look on so many of like the volunteers' faces where they're like, this is like that time where I was asked to read aloud Huck Finn in the class, and it was weird. I did not feel good, right? So I think it's really good to let them know that's like, okay, like I need an exact translation. Like if she said maricon, I need you to say maricon, right? And like what that means and what you understand that means, right? You don't. That doesn't mean you get to repeat this when you're talking with your friends about what you translated. You need to use the M word, but like for right now, you get a little bit of a pass because it is important as an attorney to get that exact translation. And then you're also like you're honoring the experience of the person, right? So it's like you're not just being really flippant with like descriptions of violence or racial slur for your client. Like they understand that like, no, we're not just saying this to say it. Like we need this exact language. Okay. Key points. You are creating an experience for your client. This is immersive theater. Consider everything. What does your costume say about you? I say this not to cape or like support like the respectability politics of Western dress, or say that like there's a certain kind of propriety that needs to happen, because I don't think that that's the case. I think that like a lot of times I think there's a lot of times I've seen a lot of lawyers in suits where it's like, bro, you look like shit. Like you have a tie on, but like you look like you slept in scotch. What is wrong with you, right? There's a lot of those, like we call them 18Bs or panel attorneys in New York, where it's like, dude, you are breathing antifreeze. It doesn't matter, you're in a suit, right? I think that so much of what we do is theatrical, and we really present a very particular kind of character to our client, and we need to be really mindful about what that character what that says, right? Like you can't really see me from the waist down, but I usually do a kind of like long skirt business casual Billy Porter kind of thing, and like I make sure the lipstick matches the nail polish, matches the tie, right? Like it's definitely not what like I wear to court when I'm like in the office, but I really try and make sure that I look like I'm there with intention. Particularly because so many of our clients just kind of get what they can get and don't get to get upset, right? So it's really nice if you look like someone that they would have chosen to work with rather than just like the person assigned it to them, right? People are more than the worst things that have happened to them. The calmer they are, the more people know about what is happening, the calmer they are. The calmer they are, the more capacity they have, right? It's pretty axiomatic. It's okay to repeat things. It's often necessary. Our clients only ever ask us one question, which is, am I safe? Will you take my case? Am I safe? Do you know when I'm going to get my asylum interview when I'm safe? Am I safe? Right? Where is your bathroom? Am I safe? Right? An energy that we can bring to all of our answers is, how can I help? And I find it's really powerful when your energy is really oriented around how can I help, and not like, what do I have to deal with? Because when you ask questions about like criminal convictions in an immigration context, if your energy says, how can I help? Then your question of, have you been arrested, lands differently, because it's like, oh, well, why do you need to know that? You still should explain it, but it feels very different when like your disposition, your attitude is not oriented around what I can do to address the situation, but is instead like, what the fuck do I got to do to win? What do I have to do to fix this, right? Rather than like, how do I help more broadly? Any questions?
We have kind of just general support going in the chat.
Cool.
There were a couple of just some questions about just interviewing like in more of like a prison environment, where you're not so much in your office, where you don't have control over your environment.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've been there. Like, yeah, some of the things. So like, when I was doing detained work, and when I've worked with people who are incarcerated generally, like, yeah, you lose so much control. So everything you can do to reestablish control becomes even more important, right? And you see this in the effects of people who are incarcerated over a long period of time. Have you ever seen anything as well organized as someone who's been doing like 10 years in jail, like the way that they organize their whole fucking life? like, like all of their bookcases, all of their shit, like that there is a way that the human mind needs to exert control over those things. So again, like whatever you can control about yourself and your environment is really key. When I would do detain work, I'd like bring in my portfolio, I would lay it the same way and almost like unzip it the same way every time that I was like setting everything out to like do the interview in the room. I'd take my watch off and put it in this one particular corner, and I'd do like the whole 8-it thing about like, this is what we're doing, boom, 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 we're going through it, and like really try and like create as much ritual and routine around everything as much as I possibly could. You know, you're working in an inherently adversarial situation there if you're in jail. So like figuring out those best ways to communicate and setting those expectations, like, you know, call me at this time, not at this time. If you don't get me, like leave a message, like, you know, figuring out with your org how to do outgoing messages so that they can like leave messages on, you know, the ways that you can get the communication through as much as possible. Like, yeah, it's like, it's unfortunate, but it's, yeah, it's the worst possible place to try and like interview a client, which is exactly why they make it that way. I've done so many interviews in hallways in jails where I just like, we're just sitting in some lounge chairs or in some plastic chairs that came from the rec room, you know what I mean? And we're just in the mostly empty hallway because they don't have a room for me, you know.
Yeah, I've been there. I've
Yeah,
done.
say, I feel like a lot of us have seen this movie. I'm only looking at Christina and I'm not looking at the thread, but like I'm like trying to get my cues. Like, okay, that sounds resonant for, you know, some people. Go.
And then we just had like a follow-up comment on the presentation to judges. Somebody had mentioned, you know, potentially not just the judges, but maybe the clerks, like reaching out to the clerks and doing something there like that. You might get an audience that's more receptive.
I mean, as far as like, just, we can get into this more like later on. So yeah, so I left my job in July to take care of, my partner works for Northwell Health and is the vice president of digital patient experience for Northwell, which is like a pretty big health company out here. So you can imagine what digital patient experience embodies in the time of COVID. So right now, mostly I, you know, run a kind of very small WeWork space for her and my 8 and my 10-year-old. And I just kind of go around and make sure everyone's got all their water and their pretzels, and I make a snack station and do a lot of IT support. And so I'm doing that and these kinds of presentations and writing a lot of poems. I have some, I'll throw it in the chat, but I'm working on a whole book, another book of poems, like my second book of poems, all about being a lawyer this time. So say all that to say, have tongue will travel, or at least like be on Zoom with you. If anybody at your org would like me to come through, if you got some plugs with some clerks or some judges who are willing to meet off the record, or even prosecutors, like you know, I'm really dedicated to trying to get a lot of this information out, and I'm interested in doing that kind of by any means necessary. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'll have my contact info later. But if you know some clerks that are down to talk, I'm super down. Like, or even the judges, if they want to be yelled at by me over Zoom for a little while, I'm definitely, I have some things to share if they're interested.
Somebody asked, what is your first book of poems called?
Oh, it's I'll put some links. It's called Murder Stay Murder. It's really, I went from being a real cheery person to an even more cheery person. But yeah, I'll put a link in at the end here of some of the stuff that I'm working on. Yeah, it's really it's really good. You know, this lawyer thing didn't work out so good, so it's good that I can fall back on the poetry. You know what I mean? It's really,
I feel like your careers are doing this like double helix.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a little double helix with $325,000 in federal student debt hanging around my neck. Good times. All right. But I always feel like, especially right now, I've never felt better about my student debt than really like the last couple of months, because it's like, you know, can't owe money to the federal government if the federal government collapses, you know. All right, I'm gonna keep going here. All right, so doing the thing, which is my Legends of Korra reference. If there are any Legends of Korra fans or general anime fans. Okay, I'm seeing some resonance. Good. I've done this presentation with so many lawyers. I've never presented to a room full of lawyers that did not have at least one anime fan. I think it's something about the voluminous aspect of anime and manga that like does it. But yeah, this is my doing the thing, right? Also read The Legend of Kyoshi if you're an Avatar fan. We'll talk more about that later. All right. So yeah, how to ask about the unspeakable. So here's some governing principles. These are like the main points, but like up at the front, or key points, but up at the front. So describing the things that haunt us is a sacred act. I understand everyone has their own relationship with like the great mystery, right? But like, even if you are not a person who believes in any kind of like God or spirituality, if you're just a strict dialectical materialist, I think everyone who does this work can agree that when people share their stories with you and have the courage, despite all of the impediments that we've already talked about existing, that we're going to talk about, but you have a real human connection with a person that is vulnerable and shares what they've been through with you, that is, I think, one of the highest aspirations that we can ever do as a species. And the bearing witness of that, I think, is also incredibly sacred. I think that there is something sacred in what we do when we hear the stories that we hear from people. And I think that one of the things that's really been lost in the sauce in how we have to talk to funders and how we have to like advocate, and like one of the things I feel like is really powerful for us to take back is the fact that what we do is so incredibly essentially important. Even our harshest critics would hope people like us were representing them and their loved ones, right? Like, I know Donald Trump hates me personally. I know Melania hopes that I die. But I also know that if she got jammed up in the alternate universe in which she had to catch a VAWA, right, which Melania Trump was trying to get help under the Violence Against Women Act, she would pray that there are people like us. And even if she doesn't see that or understand that, we do. So I feel like that's something we should really keep front of mind when we do this stuff. So telling the story generates the same internal physical reaction as the incident itself. We talked about this before. And while people may have told this story many times or never before, I've been the first person of disclosure for a lot of people, and I've also been like the 90th person because they've had to like sell their rape story, as they call like every legal service provider in New York, to try and get an asylum interview or trying to get help with their asylum case. Okay, so first and foremost, I think it's great to acknowledge the stupid and terrible questions that you have to ask. This is really oriented around the asylum context, but I feel like we all have to do these things, which is because there's no sure way to show that you cannot be trusted than ask, why didn't you go to the police? As said only by motherfuckers who have never had to go to the police. Only people who've never had to go to the cops say shit like that. So we have to prepare, but we have to prepare our clients for those kinds of questions, right? Because that's, of course, what the fucking prosecutors and the judges and the asylum officers, we always ask that shit. In so doing, you can establish an awful lot of trust, right? Obviously, when I ask a gay man from Jamaica why he didn't go to the cops when the mob nearly burned him alive, you know, it's obvious because it's illegal to be gay in Jamaica why he didn't do that. But it's good for me to ask, look, I know you didn't go to the cops for all these obvious, very good reasons, but like, can you tell me just a little bit more? Because you're going to get asked, like, in your own words, let's practice. What would you say to a judge who said, why didn't you go to the cops? Oh, well, I didn't go to the cops because all the reasons, all the obvious reasons, but also my uncle used to call me a bati boy all the time, and like, he's a cop. So you've discovered this whole important piece of information, this wonderful operative fact that like you may not have done if you didn't take the time to ask this stupid question. But you just need to acknowledge that the question is very, very stupid. Being asked to quantify and qualify who you are is inherently offensive. This is one of my favorite. Reductress is it's like The Onion. It's like a satirical newspaper, but I just love this. Bisexual woman asked to provide documentation of her previous female relationships. Just something a lot of bisexual women have told me that they have to do all the time. I have also experienced a very similar sort of stigma in slightly different ways. Particularly in immigration work and in asylum work, we quantify people's identities. And even if you're not doing immigration or asylum work, you are kind of quantifying people's identities when you're like showing that they are like a good enough person to viable for parole, right? They're a pious enough person. They're a good enough provider, right? Like all of that shit. Like, show me how you're a good parent, right? Like, that's really offensive. Again, we have to do it, but if we walk in with the understanding that we have no right to ask these questions in the first place, we ask them in a much more delicate, nuanced, and skilled way than when we're just like, okay, tell me your fucking story, because I'm gonna go pitch this shit to the judge real quick, right? This is particularly around immigration, but I think applies to some other situations. So asking to prove the nexus of sexual assault. If you're not familiar with what happens in asylum, you have to prove not only that you have been harmed, but that that harm is on account of, or at least partially on account of, your particular social group or your race or your religion, right? It's like, I'm gay, and because I'm gay, I was attacked and beaten up. And those two things need to link. Now, the problem with this is especially visible when we are talking about gendered violence and we're talking about sexual or patriarchal or however you want to call it, that kind of violence. Because there's no way to ask someone to opine as to the motivations of their rapist and not make them feel partially responsible for the rape. Why do you think that happened to you? The first intrinsic response is, oh, well, it's my fault. And then we double down on that in the constant legal show of, oh, this happened to this person because of who they are. There is no way that you could not internalize a lot of self-hatred after that exercise. And what infuriates me is that this is a pointless question. I'm just going to rant for the immigration people here for a second. Is that every sexual assault is a politicized act, right? Like that's how the UN looks at it, right? The female body is terrorized and the male body is queered. But unfortunately, we have an executive, legislative, and judicial branch that do not contain a large percentage of people, or that contain a very large percentage of people who've committed sexual assault, right? A very, like, it's what killed me in Amy Stevens's case before the Supreme Court, right? Which was, she's the trans woman that was fired for being trans. And like, of course, they're discussing it at the Supreme Court. And of course, I'm reading the oral arguments. And of course, it goes to the bathroom discussion, but it's like, you're taking up time before the Supreme Court to talk about a hypothetical situation in which this imaginary trans woman or cis man making believe that he's a trans woman is going to sexually assault women in a bathroom, and Brett Kavanaugh is right there. Like, right there, sitting right there is Brett Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas, and we're having a discussion about hypothetical rape, right? So unfortunately, that's, I'm sure, up and down our judiciary. So all we can do is reduce the harm that we cause, because unfortunately, we have a government that is, especially right now, by and for rapists, and people who enable that, and people who are so shocked at that and are so scared and so terrified at the prospect that they would know someone, or they'd be in colleague with someone, or a judge or a lawyer could commit these acts, that they shut down and they refuse to even acknowledge the reality of the situation, right? Like, for every Kavanaugh, there's 100 Gorsuches. They're just like, well, you know, there wasn't any definitive proof and she didn't go to the cops, and I'm just gonna keep on with my day, right? So I always like to start with the easy stuff. Start with the questions that are easy to answer. First interviews, confirm the biographical data, or just kind of like go over rituals and go over the situation. In subsequent interviews, when we're talking about the story, I like to confirm date, time, and weather. It adds a tremendous level of credibility, and does a thing which we'll talk about more later, which is you need to start to orient people when they're telling the story back into the moment when the story happened, and kind of go through the sense experience of it. It is inherently traumatizing to do this, but it's also kind of the only way to get at a lot of the specificity of information that we unfortunately need to get. So when you're talking about date, break it down to season, and then before or after the holiday, because memory is really elusive and really difficult. There's a bunch of stuff that I cite to in the bibliography that goes well into this, about how absurd it is what we make asylum applicants go through in terms of like remembering the years on things. But you can help people at least get like a 2 to 3 month span if you're like, okay, was it like, you know, what season was it? And then maybe was it like before, after Christmas, or Easter, right? Like that'll wind up giving you a pretty clear breakdown of what happened in terms of chronology. Also, just generally, I like to start with daily routines that are not connected to trauma, like when I'm talking to people about what their life was like. I have a whole other training on how to use literary techniques in affidavit writing, where I go a lot more into this, and I'll talk with Christina, maybe we'll set something up later on. But yeah, you want to like get people thinking about their time at that time, and like move through it in a very like chronological manner, and not too oriented around a specific target. I'll get more into that in a second. So food also tells you a lot. Consider what you can deduce from someone's grocery list, right? Like, especially when you're talking to younger clients, you can tell so much about, and it really, it becomes a proxy for secure attachment and familial support. It becomes a proxy for income, and it becomes a way to really get under the nails of your neutral detached magistrate in terms of trying to get them to understand what's really happening in this person's life. I find it incredibly important to always ask questions that are rooted in the physical lived experience of your client. Very few people who are the victims of domestic violence identify as victims of domestic violence, no matter how egregious the domestic violence was. You just don't identify that way. So asking someone if they're a victim of domestic violence or they're a victim of trafficking is completely abstract. These are from a questionnaire for emergency room workers, emergency room healthcare workers, on how to identify trafficking victims. And it's great. Right? Are there any locked doors in the windows where you slept or you worked? Right? That's a good question. It's not a good question to ask if someone's a victim of domestic violence. It's a good question to ask what the fights were like, right? What was it like when you came home, right? Are you a victim of police brutality? Walk me through moment by moment what happened when the officer pulled you over. That, right? That will get you a lot of the questions or get the answers that you're really looking for. When discussing a traumatic episode, always good to start the story 6 hours before, right? So usually a lot of my cases come to me with like somebody's got at least like a precipitating incident in terms of like, you know, this bad thing happened. If you don't have quite that situation, then, you know, figure out like you should be able to kind of like get a gist of like what are sort of the main points of trauma that you're going to be working with this person. When you ask them to tell you about it, start with like beginning of that day, and then walk all the way through. Again, it reorients someone in that experience, which is unfortunate because it exacerbates the secondary, like the effects of the trauma that they feel from it. But it is unfortunately, at least I have found, necessary to do. Also because we make judgments and answer according to the context of a question. If I ask you to describe your wedding or the birth of your child, you're going to give me the information in order that you think I think is most important. And a lot of our clients have just enough legal knowledge to think that they're going to tell us the stuff that we want to hear. But that, as I'm sure you've all experienced, is a bad situation. So you want to go through like literally the day and almost a glacial pace of like what exactly is happening and what happened. What happened next is always a very good question. And you also want to ask about what happened after the incident. It does a couple of different things. One, it helps reorient the client in the present because the story of the abuse eventually ends, right? Or the traumatic incident ends. And then they like, you know, and then they like had to go home and then they like woke up the next day. It also can wind up creating some of the most poignant and frightening images, especially when you're talking about sexual assault. So if you look at Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony in the Anointment of Brett Kavanaugh, which I really recommend, like it is a master's class, not only on testimony and like the ability for somebody to testify under pressure, but she does a really concise breakdown of like what is happening when people are dealing with traumatic memory. One of the things that she mentions is the laugh, is like Brett and his buddy laughing as she's walking down the stairs. And it's an incredibly chilling detail. And it does a very powerful thing in the context of the narrative because it gives the listener a way that they understand how they then meet the subject, right? Because if you're not a person who's ever experienced trauma, you don't know actually what happens after trauma, right? You've just watched it on TV, like somebody gets hurt and then like cut scene, but you've never had to experience the like slow and painful and sometimes humiliation of returning to like normal life and like sitting on the bus afterwards, right? The first shift you had to work after you got raped, right? It also builds really important segues in this narrative, which like create a kind of credibility that I don't think really can come from anything else. Think about, you know, your favorite TV shows. Think about like how bad Game of Thrones got at the end there, because there's all these like narrative threads that just went nowhere, right? Like what happened with the little baby that got turned into a zombie, right? Like if you ever watched the show, they turned a little baby into like these scary ice people turned a baby into a zombie, but then they didn't talk about what happens to zombie babies, right? It's just like, do they go to zombie toddler, like zombie preschool? Do they have like a little zombie cart with like all little zombie babies on it, right? There's a way that we interact with narrative and just as all humans, and if we don't have clear kind of ups and downs and clear beginnings and ends of situations, we inherently find them suspicious. And you never want your client to be regarded as suspicious or not credible. It's very important to signal to them that whatever they did to survive the event was the correct response. To imagine that one could have done better is more tolerable than the face reality of utter helplessness. I don't think I've ever met a person who's experienced trauma that didn't blame themselves for it. So it's really good to say, like, whatever they did, even if it was messy, even if it caused all these collateral issues you're dealing with now, if they hadn't done what they did, they'd have been dead or in a much worse state, and you would have never met them. So at this point, for you, for the lawyer, it's just great for you to say, like, thank you, like, thank the past person they had to be that got them to be in front of you at this moment. Some tips on helping your client get grounded. It's great that we live in the age of anxiety, because you can also just Google, and like there's tons of shit out there on like how to help when you're having a panic attack, how to help a loved one when a panic attack. Do some research, right? It's important to remember that trauma is inherently corporal, and that you are safe does not cut it, because that's our conscious mind, right? Like that's like, it doesn't like say, and safe is very abstract. I don't know what that means. So look for ways to help your client recognize that they are in a different physical place when the trauma occurred, and practice presenting those techniques with friends and family, right? With other people when you're not in crisis and they're not in crisis. Because there's nothing worse than trying to like sell like, okay, I'm gonna help you calm down. And you don't sound sincere. Shit, that you're sounding fucking shaky. So like rehearse a little bit beforehand so you can deliver that like, okay, here's what we're gonna do. Here's some suggestions on things that you can do. Sensory awareness discussion can be really good. Asking people to name the colors in the room or name the things in front of them can be like, oh, I'm reoriented here. Talking about sights and smells. Also, like having some food and some water, again, like I said earlier, is a really good thing. Also, action and movement oriented can be good. You can stand and stretch. You can ask people to like do a body scan and like talk them through doing a body scan. Again, practice doing that so you don't sound corny when you're doing it, but like it's very possible. Like if you can figure out how to deliver a good direct and a good close, you can figure out how to talk somebody down off a panic attack. Also, songs, prayers, or cool things that people say in movies or shows can be really good. Speaking of Game of Thrones, commiserating with your client about how like, what do we tell the god of death? Not today, is some shit that will put wind in your sails and make them feel better. Saying prayers with your clients, if that's your thing and their thing. Singing a song that helps calm them down, or like humming with them and reminds them, like that can be incredibly powerful in helping somebody like get back to a place where they're no longer really reliving the worst thing that has ever happened to them. And you're helping them feel like, oh fuck, if I talk to Christina and shit gets wild, Christina's gonna help get me to a place where I can like move on with the rest of my day. All right, so you always want to plan for what's next, okay? Where are they going today? Do they need anything? Can you see them again? What happens in the meantime? What are the next steps for the lawyer? Also, small talk is no small thing. There's a reason that I pepper my presentations with all this stuff, and I talk about Game of Thrones and my in-laws and my partner and my weird eccentric bullshit and like all of that, is because I truly believe that by talking about that, I am signaling to you that I am not just this talking head in this box. I am not just this lawyer. I am not just this role. I am a three-dimensional human being with favorite cartoons and stupid inside jokes and all that shit. And I am tacitly acknowledging in that performance that you are that too, and that I recognize that you are more than this moment too. And so I think it is so important. I hate the lawyer robot persona. It infuriates me when lawyers feel like they can't be people, because I don't want a robot to come get me out of jail. I don't believe they will. I only have the capacity to believe in a fellow human being. And if you show up in your just keeping to your role as a client, what's my role? My role is victim, right? By the system or by the people who've hurt me. My role is what? Right? It's respondent. It's so narrow, it's so small. Commiserating with your client as a human being expands literally the humanity of both people, which I think is essential, not only to navigate your own trauma, but to help your client navigate the trauma. All right. Also, no, you will have to go over the plan again, right? I loved this tweet. I felt like this was so appropriate to our line of work, right? It's like, I go to see my therapist, right? So you have ADHD, and I can tell because it's literally my job to understand these things. Oh, wow, amazing, thank you. Okay, now fill out this paperwork and do an errand and call someone and arrive in minutes early and don't miss any appointments, right? As your lawyer, I totally understand that you've been through literal hell. The kinds of things that you've described to me are what would crush someone's mind and spirit. I'm going to get angry as shit at you if you don't remember to bring your passport next time because I'm your lawyer, right? Like, come on, right? We got to know it. Okay. Um, Something I again like hear a lot from lawyers and I want to address and I think is a really again like a change in attitude, right? So this is a reframing on the my client lied to me thing. We have felt, we feel, etc. So first and foremost, data collection is not a neutral act. My partner, I cite to the blog where she talks about this, working in healthcare. The way in which I ask you about your rape changes the way you will respond. Right, like the act of collecting the data. When I did that presentation with my friend Heron, okay, Heron is a researcher primarily on bisexuality issues, right? Big thing that they talk about, bi plus issues. One of the things that's in their research, and I can share these slides if anyone's interested, is that way more non-white women identify as bisexual than white women. Like statistically, like way more. So couple of things that might cause that. Now, obviously, there's the ridiculous racist one, which is that more non-white women are bisexual, which is crazy, right? Or white women know that it's dangerous to disclose that you're bisexual. And white women tend not to have to be in situations where they need to disclose those sorts of things, right? Because they tend to be more affluent and therefore tend to not have to use the services like we employ, right? Data collection is not neutral. The way that we ask it changes the response to it. Also, if you're a queer person or a person from an abusive family dynamic, lying to your primary caregivers just kept you alive. Real shit. So like the fact that this Johnny or Janie come lately with their like fancy suit and tie and they're like just supposed to be trusted because they're a lawyer, like come on, man. No, like if I don't trust my father, if I don't trust my uncle, if I don't trust my mother, why do I trust you? Every new and old relationship is approached with the same implicit question: which side are you actually on? And not all identities are visible, right? You may have shown that you are not trustworthy just by making some joke about the crackheads up the block. Because if you make a cute joke about crackheads, I'm probably not going to tell you about my substance abuse habit, right? Make sure you are clear why you are asking every question. A lot of times people, again, like have just enough legal knowledge to be dangerous. So our clients will presume that like, oh shit, well, if my lawyer knows about X, Y, and Z thing, they're going to have to tell the authorities, which is not the case at all, which is something I tell them all the time, is that like, even if you tell me that you've lied on every immigration paper you've ever done, I'm not going to tell ICE. I can't represent you, but I'm not going to tell ICE either. I won't even tell the lawyers that I'm referring you to. It's on them to figure it out, or it's on me not to refer you, right? So make sure you're clear why you're asking every question. No, I just need to know about your criminal contact because I need to prepare for it because the trial attorney is going to know about it. I also feel like, again, pictures worth 1,000 words. So how you see yourself may be very different than how you are seen. This is from Brett Kavanaugh's coronation. I love this picture because it's such an amazing display of like all of the different kinds of idiocy with regards to these issues, right? So you have Mr. Carpo, who I feel like if I wrote and cast him for like a West Wing style drama, people would be like, Jeff, you are way too heavy handed in your picture of systemic misogyny. Like, I can assure you that Mr. Crapo, I don't even know how to say his name. I don't bother because he's such a caricature. He looks like he has never said the word vagina in proper context. He has only ever said that when you're not supposed to, or when he was supposed to, said something else. He strikes me as a hoo-ha guy when he's talking to like younger female relatives. You know, Flake, you can already see the sad tweets in his face, right? Like he thinks he's putting up a good front. He thinks he's being neutral and detached. Look at that guy. Look at that guy. He already knows what he's doing. He knows he's voting and he knows he's gonna like come up with some bullshit excuse. The one, see, the one next to him looks like a golden retriever in a bad way. Again, like, I'm just not understanding. I just don't understand. I just don't understand why. I mean, he was a football player. Why would he have to rape people? Like, that's the energy he's giving off. And then Ted Cruz is like, fuck it, I'm the Zodiac killer. It's just a matter of time before I get caught. I'm not even a human being. I am a sack of skin, like in Men in Black, filled with roaches and rats. And then the one that kills me is the counsel, right? Is this woman they brought in who's like a prosecutor in like Arizona or something around like domestic violence issues. Look at that face. Look at that face. Do you really mean to tell me that she's got a good conviction record? Because I wouldn't tell her shit unless I had to. So again, sometimes there's nothing that you could have said, right? Trauma affects memory, right? What is most relevant, like, or sometimes people just straight cold forget about stuff. Like there's a way these don't come up. What's most relevant to the case may not be most relevant to them. Right. Again, like what somebody leaves out of the story around their trauma might just be because like it was very regular to them. Again, like small anecdote from my own practice. I had this client, Guyanese trans woman, HIV positive, came to me using male pronouns and trying to do a case mostly around the prejudice and violence that she experienced from her HIV diagnosis. Um, come to find out over a period of time working with her that like no, like she really identifies as a trans woman. She can really like be in that identity a lot more now that she's not in a country where you get burned alive for that shit. And she told me the night before her asylum interview about this story about this friend of hers that went on a date with a cop and got beaten really badly and then died a couple of days later. Perfect for the immigration folks, like perfect nexus. We have state sponsored violence, the whole thing. She didn't not tell me that because she didn't trust me, right? Like she came out to me over the course of our relationship. She didn't tell me that because that didn't even rank in the top 5 of horrible shit that had happened to her in her life, right? At least she got to go to Red's funeral, right? Um, Also, there's an aspect of self-harm and self-sabotage that I think are really common in people who've experienced trauma. And we occupy a very particular role in people's lives. It's a concept in psychology called transference, which is when a client or a patient will sort of project onto their caregiver or onto their clinician or their doctor a lot of for lack of a nicer term, baggage and effect and like experience with previous people that they remind them of. My friend Andy Eisenson and Diana Adams run a really great family law firm, and they always talk about how people will always find a divorce attorney that is like how they wish their ex was, right? Like we deal with a lot of transference and then counter transference, right? Which is like we project our own shit onto our clients. But if your client, I've had situations with clients where we get along great and there's a lot of trust, and then they start doing shit to like kind of test me, like to see how I react when I'm disappointed and how do I react when I get told a lie or like a half lie, half truth, because they're feeling out whether or not I can actually be trusted. So it's just important to remember all these things during frame. But I think most important when we move away from the entitlement around the information, when we do not act like we are owed anything in terms of this person's life, I feel like it generates much stronger casework and lessens the possibility of us being, quote, lied to. Because it's not if, it's when, it's not if you make a mistake, it's when, right? So breathe, don't panic, right? Correct yourself and then apologize, but not more than twice. Because if you apologize more than twice, then you're kind of forcing the person you're apologizing to like do the emotional labor of making you feel better. And then you just have to stop apologizing and move on. This is a great modification of the quote by Audre Lorde, which is you may lose, your client may lose trust in you, which is painful, but let that pain motivate you to do better. Other good reminders, get comfortable with uncomfortable silences. We're a very chatty profession and a very chatty culture. So I think it's really good not to step on your questions, even if you're going to wind up leading in like the interview. So like, ask your question and then wait like a full 10 seconds before asking your follow-up, right? Because in that 10-second pocket, people can figure out their language, what they're going to say, figure out their like the words that they want to use around it, right? Like give people that pause. Always be aware of your reactions, right? When I do that 10-second thing live, it's so uncomfortable. All these lawyers are like, they were talking so much and now they're not talking. It's really bad. But yeah, practice being in that uncomfortability for a moment. It's really important to say thank you as often possible and acknowledge how hard it is to disclose all these things. Also, adrenaline affects people different ways, and you are people. So, recognize how it's showing up with you because it is. So some key points, right? Your questions should not sound like a lawyer is asking them, but be prepared to explain why they are legally relevant. Telling the story of a traumatic incident triggers the same responses as living through the traumatic incident, so act accordingly. If you do something to a patient that you would not do to a friend or children, consider whether or not you are unwittingly replicating the trauma of that patient's past. This is Bessel van der Kolk, Body Keeps the Score. While we do replicate the trauma in those interactions, right, and in terms of the interview portion of the program, what we can do is think about like the way we talk to our client, the way we prep our client for testimony, right? All the other stuff that's not the like actively digging their fucking story out of them. All of the ways that we can show that we are a secure person to believe in, and be really mindful, like, oh shit, am I just dragging you along to this thing in a really fucked up way without your consent? Right? And how does that remind you of anything else? Your clients are not trying to trick you for fun. Maybe they are terrified, or they are terrified. Maybe they don't trust you, and maybe they're not wrong for that. Any questions?
So we have a couple. Earlier, you were kind of talking about robot attorneys going in, and we're not robots.
Yeah.
But frequently, especially in the capital defense community, people will work in teams. And
then you get the big firm folkers coming through. Yeah, no,
yeah, sometimes get big firms, but sometimes even some of our colleagues will be kind of put on that robot persona. And so, what do you do if you've got, you know, the person next to you is kind of being a robot, and or
So yeah, I mean, this actually connects to a larger question, which is how do we tell people who are technically are like, for whom we are the subordinate, right? How do you and when you are in a subordinated position, when you actually know more than the person, how do you manage up, basically, is really what you're talking about, like, right? Because it's like, because really, like, how do you manage up or manage across when really, like, the power dynamic is up, right? In those situations, I mean, it has a lot to do with that power dynamic and that managing up. I would imagine there's some good techniques that, like, exist out there in, like, the business world around, like, okay, can we do, like, a little check-in afterwards? Can we talk about, like, you know? So I felt like that didn't actually go well. What did you think about that one point, right? And actually bringing, I think one thing that we can do is just bring a lot more attention to these moments, because they just get, like, skimmed over a lot of time. And attention, you know, where attention goes, energy flows, right? So if we are in our practice always like, how did that moment when they said that, how did that, like, land with you? Like, did that seem weird? Did it feel like I alienated? Use yourself. It's like, put yourself out there. It's like, do you think I bothered them? And you're going to be, like, again, kind of like tacitly forcing maybe your superior to, like, ooh, wait, you know, my junior attorney is, like, really conscious of how they're showing up. Maybe I need to think about how I'm showing up, right? Like I think that more than anything else, like, how we get this into people's heads is we just normalize it, right? Like, we make the discussion of people's traumatic injuries. We make the lived experience of what has happened. We make all of the psych stuff. We make all the sociology stuff. We just make it so fucking normal to talk about, and such a standard thing all of the time. And, like, if people push back, all right, fine, they win that battle, but you just change the Overton window of, like, what's allowed to be said in a law office. And I feel like I've already seen that change over the last couple of years. I feel like we talk about it really started with that Betty Ford ABA paper that came out in 2016. But, like, there's a certain zeitgeist right now where, like, I think enough boomer attorneys are powerful enough and are getting to retirement age and are starting to see the effect on their bodies and their minds of what they've been through. And because, unlike previous generations, boomers are one of the first generations that have to be conscious for so much more of their retirement than previous generations, right? Like, for my parents' generation, because my parents are boomers, right? Like, you just got old and you fucking died, right? That was a wrap. But, like, now, you know, cats retire at, like, 70, like, you got another 20 years. And I think that the discussion around trauma in the legal culture has tracked with that, because I think that there's enough people now who are retiring that grew up in this cohort where they're just sensitive enough to, oh yeah, I mean, like, what somebody has been through, like, maybe it affects them, right? But I think that we have the power right now, we have the upper hand rhetorically, especially because business as usual is failing us so obviously badly, right? Like, there is, like, having done this presentation for the last 4 years, like the status quo is clearly not cutting it for so many attorneys, that if we just come in with any ideas, like, I feel like we have a huge opportunity to just set the tone of the room, because the previous tone of, like, no, this is how lawyers act, because in America we have the rule of law. And it's important that we maintain this culture, because if we don't have this very kind of aloof, you know, erudite, waspy, you know, disposition of all of our legal culture, it'll all fall apart. I mean, if everybody is too warm and fuzzy with their clients, the whole thing won't work. It's like, well, the whole thing's not working now, and it's not due to the fact that that people like me and you, Christina, are talking about our feelings too much. Like, it's due to the fact that there's entrenched corruption and racism in this entire system, and part of that entrenched corruption and part of that racism is a lack of acknowledgement of the lived experience of the people that are in all of the people that are involved in it, right? It's all of that white supremacy culture is what's creating so much of what we're dealing with right now. So that is my larger mission in terms of like direct interaction. Like, yeah, one of the hardest things, especially, I have a friend who does a lot of pro bono counsel stuff, and like, you can't fucking win to lose. Like, if you are doing habeas defense or you are doing that kind of defense and you're working with outside counsel who don't know from prison litigation, right? They're big badass commercial litigators and they move around hundreds of millions of dollars like it's nothing, but like, they don't know about roll call, right? And so you're simultaneously having to like teach them practical legal doctrinal things while also being their like Virgil through hell. And I have some colleagues, particularly colleagues who are women, particularly colleagues who are not white, who, because of that power imbalance, because you're dealing with a lot of like fragile white men who are like, what do you mean you're not telling me my job? Like, yeah, so I don't have a solution per se, but like, let me just let you know, if you're dealing with that, you are very seen. And I have a lot of thoughts and discussions, and I can put you in touch with people who are directly doing that work right now that will at least be able to commiserate with you on how difficult that is to like, to be so much better at this job than the people who think that they're so important and good at it because they work for the firm that's paying the bills.
We have a couple more, a couple of questions came in as you were talking. This one is from a little bit earlier, actually, right when we kind of started this section. They're saying that they're not an attorney, but a legal assistant in their office, allowed to do some mitigation work. And when interviewing, they often share their own life experiences with their client because they sort of feel like it's a little unfair to ask the client to share what's going on with them if they don't kind of have this give and take. And they just want to know what your thoughts were about that.
No, totally agree. Again, like practice makes practice. So like have in your head your like freestyles about like, in New York, it's easy. We can always complain about the weather and the trains, except for when the 2 weeks when it's gorgeous and the 2 weeks when the trains work. But generally, we can always have that small talk that we can talk about. So, but I highly recommend, like, if you're in that position, particularly if you're in a legal assistant or like a paralegal position where you're going to have a lot of people who don't actually know better than you telling you what to do. That you be able to articulate your practice around it and have like, okay, so I talk about this, and this, right? And like have like kind of the anecdotes in your head and have those sort of like ready to go at any moment's notice, not just for your clients and to formalize that practice, but if you get someone that's like, no, you're not supposed to do that, you say, no, this is not accidental, this is intentional. Like, I am very clear and I have a thing that I do for this reason and I talk about these things. So yeah, I mean, I think that you are doing a great job, legal assistant. I think that's really appropriate. I think just get even more specific about your craft with it, because people will try and test you like it's not a real thing. Yeah, dude. Yeah, your senior partner who's on his third divorce is going to tell you that you don't know how to get along with people, right? You know, just word.
This one is a little bit longer. So I'm going to read this one. Since the pandemic in detained immigration defense, we've had to build our entire relationship with clients through time-limited phone calls that are not nearly as confidential as anyone would like.
Yep.
Often those calls are doled out sparingly, like you get 3 calls 1 week apart apiece between someone's initial appearance and when their applications are due.
Yep. Yeah.
So, and then is there anything that we can do to lay more groundwork for trust and to take care of the either the lawyer or the paralegal who
try and do the best you can. Like, let me say something that I said before, which is like, that is such an untenable and unfair situation for you to be in, period. That is just morally wrong to try and make you like get the information you need through such a convoluted measure. And yeah, if you'd like to follow up with me individually, I can put you in touch with some people that I know that are specifically doing that work that you could like share even more like deeper cuts, best practices, like, you know, because I'm not doing detained work right now. So like, I don't know when's like the good time to like be on the phone bank at Chrome. You know what I mean? Like if you're like, it can get pretty fucking niche, right? It's like, well, at Adelanto, right? Or like, you know, like do these things, right? Um, so yeah, so figuring out that as much as possible, and I can try and connect you with some folks who also may be able to be like of a little bit more support. Um, you know, I think that like having, you know, as much as you can get like other information and other follow-up information to them, I don't know like how, like what kind of mail postage and like what kind of time turnaround, you know what I mean? Like generating materials that you can then like legally mail that like break some of that shit down can be really good. Also, it's good to get out there to those jailhouse lawyers about like, you know, so what does it look like bond case to individual? You know what I mean? Like trying to get rid of some of the time that you wind up having to spend like explaining all that shit, but letting them know it's like, I'll explain all this shit, but I'm sending it to you. You know, that I think might be a tactic that might be workable. Again, not always, because you're under the gun a lot of times. Um, you know, I think it's just you're in that situation, you're really just playing the video game on like impossible level. Right. But it's all, but like, I unfortunately don't have any other like up, down, down, left, right, ABBA start like cheat codes for you like to make it work. Cause it's like, yeah, like you need to talk to somebody to gain trust. Right. You need to like, it's really hard to talk to them through like a crackly ass Zoom. Right. Like it's just, it's, you're dealing with an incredibly difficult situation. And I wish I had more that I could tell you, but all I can tell you is that I see it and I see you, and I have some other people that do most immediately that work that I think might be more qualified than me to tell you some good ins and outs about like scheduled phone calls. That's one thing that I hear a lot of folks who are doing detained right now. It's like because this calls are so few and far between, like really getting like making sure people know exactly when they are and like prepping yourself in your room as much as possible. But like you probably already know about all that stuff. So I'm sorry. I wish I had more for you.
Well, maybe what we could do is, if you have some resources and stuff to, that we can reach out to some of these people
Absolutely.
afterwards.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I really regard, and like just generally on all this stuff, like if there's something here that is very resonant, if you want to talk more, like I'm very much on the emails, and I'm like I said, and I'm gonna get into a second here. Like I feel like it's what what's necessary not only for our practice of law but our like practice of humanity. Speaking of, I got officially 10 minutes left. Are we a hard out at 5, or like what? How am I doing here, Christina? Because I went long, like I goddamn near always do. But
So unfortunately, yeah, we do have kind of a hard stop at 5, only because I teach a course shortly
oh,
afterward.
I got you. No, legit, and it's your Zoom. Okay, so I'm gonna skip the break and I'm gonna go hella fast through this next part, like I wasn't already talking incredibly quickly. But yeah, so I'm just gonna I'm just gonna go. Okay, so checklists, right? Seems like a good time to review. What is the physical experience of the room? Do they understand what is happening, right? Ask yourself these things before the interview. After the interview, how are you feeling? Do they know what's going on? Do they know what's next? How are you feeling? All important stuff. During the interview, this slide is left intentionally blank. During the interview, just be present. Just be there about what's going on. Steinbeck gets it, which is this was a letter that he wrote to his doctor, which was what I want a doctor more than anything else, a friend with special knowledge. If I had never dived and I were with you, it would be my purpose to instruct you on the depths and dangers, both the pleasant and the malign. Right? Just be a friend with special knowledge. So in the realities of 2020, subtitle: What the actual fuck. So first, I want to say, full disclosure, I am not okay. There is a tacit implication by the nature of pedagogy that I am somehow absolved of trauma, that I never fuck up with my clients, that I'm fully healed. Nothing could be further from the truth. I have an official diagnosis of PTSD. I rip the hell out of myself all the time for the shit that I do that is not great when I fail my clients. I just want to put that out there. You are also not okay, friends. We are all dealing with a terrible situation. You are being forced to comply with absurd, ridiculous requests from bad actors who obviously want to hurt you. That's not okay. Also, the world is not okay. We're kind of going through this whole COVID thing right now. We're kind of going through this whole recurrence of fascism thing right now. There's this whole cadre of aging, decrepit, pathetic patriarchs who wind up getting on Borat trying to jerk off in front of a 15-year-old when they used to be the mayor of New York. We are run by the worst people right now, and the whole world is suffering for it because they're all these sad old men that are just afraid of death. So One of the things that we also need to deal with is the underlying toxicity in legal culture, and that we are an inherently antagonistic profession, right? I love this quote. There's a lot of high stress professions. Being a physician has stress. However, they do not send a surgeon into a surgical suite to perform a surgery. They do not send another physician trying to kill the patient. All of our legal culture has been so masked for so long in procedural niceties that I feel like we are laughably ill-equipped to deal with fascists, which is what we are dealing with right now, right? We hold ourselves to these standards of courtesy to people that literally do not care about the rule of law anymore. There's also this particular toxicity in immigration culture that I feel like has seeped over to everywhere else, which is cases in immigration court, shout out to the god Dana Marks, amount to death penalty, and all judges are still bastards, even her. Cases in immigration court, she doesn't get a pass, all judges. Cases in immigration court amount to death penalty cases heard in traffic court settings. She's talking about the due process rights, right, of people in immigration courts. But also, we haven't dealt with the fact as an immigration bar that we've had people do death penalty cases in traffic court for years and just let it slide. So what does that do to the lawyers who are doing this over and over again? All you habeas defenders can speak to, like, the wear and tear on the mind and body. And we don't even have a scintilla of that in immigration court in terms of our culture and our understanding of the stakes of what we're doing. Okay. You are not paranoid. People are actually out to get you. I took this picture in 26 Federal Plaza, waiting with my client for an ICE check-in when I had to watch Donald Trump let me know in front of the UN that I am unjust and that my rhetoric is evil and divisive. I will absolutely affirmatively stay on the record and will swear and testify to this. The reason that the immigration courts remain open, the non-detates remain open, is that Bill Barr and Stephen Miller understand that immigration attorneys are the perfect vector because Stephen Miller is a white supremacist and wants to enact genocide. And he is trying to use our physical bodies in order to spread germs. I will not be moved from that position. So what are we dealing with right now when we have like literally the administration of, particularly in immigration court, it's not Article 3, it's all of them with their wrath aimed directly at us. And it's also way beyond that, right? I love this, right? One way to think about the damage Donald Trump has done. I remember George Zimmerman had fringe supporters when Trayvon Martin was murdered. Kyle Rittenhouse now has all of the support of the Republican Party. Right, it's a very, very different world than it was just 4 years ago. Even though 4 years ago it was also a terrible mess. So that gets us to this idea of moral injury. I really recommend looking it up. Moral injury is a term used in military settings and also sometimes in medical settings about when you feel an inherent contradiction. Because I do feel that all lawyers, even myself, as cynical as I was when I came in, I became a lawyer because I do believe in systems. I don't believe in nations. I don't believe in borders, but I believe in systems of accountability. I believe that if you've been through hell, there should be a professional person who you tell all of your shit to. And while my therapist has told me that he has nightmares about the stories of my clients' lives that I have told him. The thing that actually kills me is the way that I feel complicit in my clients' ongoing harm because I'm the person that's got to tell them that their case got referred. I'm the person that's got to tell them that like they're not going to get their EAD, right? I feel complicit in this larger system by the nature of my position in it because I am a lawyer, right? So we also have a situation in which a lot of our nonprofit industrial complex is doing a lot more harm than good. Go ahead and you can check that out at your own leisure. Which brings me to this concept called vicarious trauma, which you may have heard. So vicarious trauma is, I think, a somewhat inaccurate term at this point, because I think that we are also subjected to direct trauma. But I think that this identification and avoidance and overreaction, I really recommend reading. I also recommend reading James Baldwin's writing on it, which is that there are people who court madness through pain because they perpetually re-remember stuff, and people who court another kind of madness because they try to forget. And I feel like that sums up one of the two categories of all the immigration attorneys that I know, or all the attorneys, period. So there's also vicarious resilience, which is the unique and positive effects that happens from going through this process and working with people. I believe that the importance is to feel more, not less, right? Thich Nhat Hanh has a great idea about this and a great metaphor where if you pour water into a cup or salt into a cup of water, it becomes undrinkable, but the same salt in a river is manageable. And it's because the amount of identity that you are determines the leverage of the effect. If you are only a lawyer, if you are just this thing, you will stay small and narrow and you will be totally salted by all of the shit. But if you see yourself as part of a movement and a continuum and a collective, you can take on a lot more damage, because it's not just about you, it's about who you support, it's about who you're carrying the torch from, it's about all of that. I really recommend sharing wholesome memes and get tattoos. I can go more about this later, but check out, it's in the materials, which is something from the folks at Alo Delato, the people who do the support at the border. I really recommend getting involved in political work that is not directly connected to your job, and doing things like rituals, like getting tattoos, having inside jokes, like sharing memes that connect you and the people that you work with, because a lot of other people do not experience the world the way we do, and you need to have a tight in-group cohesion with the people that are also kind of in the trench with you. I have like 1 more minute. I'm just going to run through. Make friends in adjacent industries. Do that a lot. Don't think of yourself as an ally. Think of yourself as an accomplice. The materials will be out there. Find ways to count your wins, right? This is my friend's. This is another friend of mine's. This was mine. I have a box. It's now like 25 rocks in it, of just like every time I win a case, I put a rock in the box. I have a much longer spiel about this that I can record maybe for you sometime. But here's like the end piece, and I'm going to wrap up with like literally seconds to spare, right? This is from Judith Herman talking about when psychologists were basically being maligned by the larger like culture, because they were pointing out how many people were being hurt and assaulted and molested when they were young and would not realize it and remember it until they were much, much older. Because though frightening, these attacks are an implicit tribute to the power of the healing relationship. They remind us that creating a protected space where survivors can speak their truth is an act of liberation. They remind us that moral neutrality in the conflict between victim and perpetrator is not an option, and that if you stand with the victim, you will eventually face the perpetrator's unmasked fury. But for many of us, there is no greater honor. And I just want to say thank you so much to Christina for all of the time. Thank you so much to all of you for all of your attention. There is truly no greater honor for me than to sit here and to talk with y'all for a couple hours. And hopefully in the future as well, here's all of my things about like all of this shit. I really would like to keep the conversation going. I'm so sorry that I couldn't do, the end piece is really the like, you know what I mean? It's the stirring point where it's like you get a little bit more heartfelt. I know this is a dark ride, but please be in touch. I will send materials to Christina, who's got to go do her thing immediately, and then she can send those out, as well as links and contacts. And here's how to get a hold of me. And just thank you all so much for all of your time and all the things.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, we have sort of a standing ovation in the chat box for you. So thank you so much. I know you can't see everybody.
No, it's okay. I'm gonna go back. I'll look at it later. It's okay.
But yeah. And then you know, to the folks who attended this, I'll ask some of the remaining questions. We'll share some notes. I'll include that with the slides and email that out to everybody. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
And everybody have a great night.
Take care, friends. Bye.
Bye.